Thanks, man. This. So, just to kind of get you started on a good laugh. If you don't know the joke yet, you got to Google it. The dormant cyber pathogen is out there. You got to be careful of it. It can take you out. That's what the FBI is saying, not me. Maybe. So, building an application security program. This talk's not going to talk about tools. If you don't know the tools, just Google for it. I will tell you at the end, I'm going to talk about a couple upcoming talks. This is kind of like a shortened version. This is, I guess, the TED Talk of building an application security program. I'm going to have an extended version at a conference here in less than a month. A little bit about me. I do security strategy and architecture right now, but I've built 2 successful application security programs. One that the next CISO let die. One that's still in use today. One that was getting off the ground until basically they didn't want to spend any more money, and they just let the tools sit around and rot and die. And now I'm building another application security program. At least trying to. It's kind of important in my opinion, but if you have any questions later, talk about my background. You want to talk about me, you can. I don't care. I don't like talking about me. Disclaimer, I always do this, even though this is a pretty benign talk, I always put this up there. Like anything in life, please use common sense. If you go out and randomly scan somebody's stuff, they could get mad, they could sue you, you could get fired. It's kind of interesting. You think about our industry. Can't tell you how many people I know that have gotten fired. I think everybody, if you haven't gotten fired once, you're not really in information security yet. Because eventually, at one point or another, somebody will find a way to fire you. Because they just don't like the message that you're bringing, and they like to shoot the messenger. So think before you act. All right. So when we think about application security, it's the path of least resistance. We think about hacking and what are people doing. One person wants to get something else. It's not all that complicated. It's not all that hard. But when we think about app security, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start looking for my weaknesses. I'm going to try to exploit a control. I'm going to liberate a function, as they call it these days. And then finally, I'm going to produce what's called a business impact. I am going to present today, focus more on the business side. What do you need to do to get that app security program up and running? Because as much as you want to go ahead and do application security work, you got to convince someone to let you go do it. You got to convince them to give you money. You got to convince them to do a lot of different things. Okay? But we think about this path of least resistance. It's about the hacker mindset. It's about going after the goods, going after the data. Back when I first got started, lots of defacement stuff. You did have some of the hacking that went on where people actually went to jail, and you had the whole Free Kevin movement. You had that type of stuff. But nowadays, probably half the people in this room, you could probably go make a good living going to Argentina and collecting the money that just gets shipped in from the U.S. every single day. Or Western Europe, for that matter. It's a big industry. It's a lot of money that's floating out there, with people hacking. Why not take advantage of it? I still think that's my retirement program, to be brutally honest with you, because it hasn't been going so well so far. But we think about the threats. You think about what's going on. Look at the connected car vulnerabilities. We saw that last summer. You saw what Charlie Miller did. You saw their demonstration that was on the news. Everyone freaked out. Everyone's like, "Oh my God." This stuff's been sitting around for years. None of this stuff has changed. In most cases, all it really gets back to the fact nobody did any testing. Nobody looked at anything. They just didn't go out and do their basic groundwork. You look at critical infrastructure, the power industry, you look at most manufacturing, you look at things that are Internet of Things, IoT. It's amazing to me how many people never thought that their kids. I think there was a Teddy Ruxpin that now can get hacked and save obscenities of people wirelessly. It's just amazing to me how many people forget about the fact that you've got a computer in everything. There's nothing that's a computer. I mean, it just is. I mean, we have microcontrollers, microprocessors. We got everything that's so small it's ridiculous. So when you start looking at the threats out there, it seems like everyone's got some type of computer and a web interface. Okay, most IP phones, they still have web interfaces that you can still go ahead and mess with. The original Cisco IP phones didn't have any security on them. They're completely wide open. So we'd go in and hack each other's phones, and essentially a friend of mine, I won't say his name, but his last name was School. We call him Schoolgirl. All his phone messages started popping up as Schoolgirl all throughout the entire company, his pager, you name it. It was awesome. The fun that you could do back in the day. But nowadays, what if I could actually spoof the phone and convince someone to go out there and give me the entire employee database like they did at, what was it, just a couple days ago, the big whaling attack that happened. What's that? Snapchat, yes, thank you. You see that type of stuff and you're just like, yep. And the company where I was at previously, we had some guys try to do it twice. They tried to do the exact same scenario twice. The second one, they actually convinced the first layer of defense, the first person in the line to do it. So he escalated, got up to the CFO, and the CFO is going, "Why did you even send this to me?" It was interesting. So we look at those threats. There's tons of them out there. There's tons of attacks. It's just a matter of hunting them down. So we think about application security. What's our goal? It's simple. We want to reduce risk. Now, this goes back to the old NSA adage, way back when. I can spend infinite amounts of money to get myself 99.9, and I stretch out the nines, reduction of risk. The question is, how many nines do I want to take it out to? How far do I want to go? How far do I want to get? I'll never have perfect security, but I can definitely reduce, the risk by spending more money and typically stretching those nines out. Now, the problem you don't want to have when you look at this graph, you look at the red line and the blue line, I don't want to spend an infinitely insane amount of money to get myself down to a risk level that's just not manageable for a company. If I have a company that does $10 million in business, we sell $10 million worth of widgets, they can't turn around and do $10 million worth of security. It's just not going to work. Maybe they can do $100,000 worth of security. Well, what I see a lot of people do in application security, or even security in general, is they try to overspend. They always overspend. These vendors out there, they convince us to buy what amounts to water for the price of wine. You're really trying to get to the point of D. You want to spend to a point where you reduce the risk down to a manageable level. And at the same time, we don't want to essentially spend so little that we're at point A and we have this high degree of risk. Okay? Again, it seems simple, but yet everyone seems to blow it. With application security, we really have to go in with the same mindset. We're going to try to convince business people to essentially give us money to go do this function. So, I stole this from Chris Weissapol from Veracode. There's a link for it right there. Again, this being a 30-minute talk, I was trying to condense things down. But the 4 steps to app security, right? This is what he outlined, and it's pretty much right on the money. I think it's a good outline to get people going. You want to start simple and start small. Set your policies and standards. Start with your metrics. Scale your AppSec to your SDLC. Scan third-party apps. And that's probably more of a plug on his side, but the way I interpret it as is kind of his evolution of how you should expand your program. Okay. Start simple, start small. Vast majority of companies simply don't understand what we do. I actually had a CISO once, and this was in 2005. He was from Europe, and me being not a Native American, but being an American, he was here in the U.S. and he's doing his tour and whatever, and it's like 8 o'clock at night, and me and another gentleman by the name of Eric, we're basically going through and we're pen testing an application for what used to be Zurich Insurance. Okay, we're going through and we're hitting this app, and he goes, "Wow, so what are you guys doing?" We explain, we're doing application security. We're trying to find vulnerabilities, and he just leans in, and he's got his little minion right next to him with his little notepad. Why would you do that? That was his words. He's a CISO who's asking us, the same CISO who approved the application security program would ask us, why would we go ahead and behave like the hacker? We quickly responded, hey, we're doing this because we want to prevent it before this app goes live from the bad guy doing it. That same app in particular, that he was like, why would you do this? And the first thing you can see the minion was writing down was probably the money side, like, why are we spending this money? That app, we actually found a way to dump the entire database. So we actually dumped some of the wealthiest people in North America and Europe's, financial information right there in the app. Socials and all. And then that's when we proved to them, here's the reason why you do this. That program's still alive today. But many CISOs, they don't get it. They just simply don't get it. Most business people aren't going to get it. You've got to convey it well enough for the business to understand it. And remember, and I know a lot of people hate to hear it, but the business doesn't care about security. They never have, they never will. We care about security, but the business, they want to go sell widgets, they want to sell you insurance, they want to regulate something, they want to go do something else. The only people who want to do security are security companies. And well, let's face facts, they're probably, and I'm sure there's some security companies in here, but I hope you don't get to take offense to the fact that they're probably closer to where Satan lives. All right? There's a special hell in the world for software companies and security companies. But we got to work with them, so I like to play in the sandbox nicely. But just remember that when we think about that, the business doesn't care about security. We got to make them care. We got to convince them and show them why it's time to care. We start simple, we start small. The biggest thing I see people do is I see them go out and they attempt to say, we got to go spend $700,000. And the person looks back at you and just laughs. Why do I have to spend $700,000 for something I just don't see? I don't get it. You got to start small. Start small. Start showing them those little vulnerabilities. Show them the little nuances you find. Show them the business logic that's corrupt and not working. Why policies and standards matter? Pretty much during two phases of any project, in particular the project definition, system overview, those are their greatest points of impact on a project. If you wait until implementation to show somebody that they have a vulnerability or they have some type of risk, they're going to be like, I don't care, too late, sucks to be you. You've made no impact on the application. In fact, you really have taken a step back. You've got to get involved early. This is at the architecture phase. This is where you're going to be at, depending upon where you're at in your SDLC. Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Where you're at in your SDLC, you're essentially at the beginning. You're getting into that framework. You're trying to explain to people how you are going to do security within the project. Hopefully you've got standards that actually say, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. Policies are kind of like the 10 Commandments in a way. It's the best way I can relate to people. Those are the ones that are like, you must use a password. Really usually pretty watered down and weak. Standards are saying like, my password's got to be like, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, 24 digits in length, two-factor auth if I'm remote, whatever it may be. But those really matter, because if not, what happens at this phase is that people go, well, you tell me where it is in here that I have to follow your rules. And let's face fact, the developer doesn't care. Developers in general, their objective is to get a project done as quickly as possible. They probably have too many projects as it is. They're trying to get something achieved, and they just can't get it done in the amount of time they're probably allocated anyways. So don't show up at the 11th hour and tell them, hey, NASA, you have a problem. On the bottom of all these, a number of the slides, I've got this orange thing. It's kind of like the big message. So that way it's a big takeaway. Why do metrics matter? ROI, return on investment. It still amazes me how many people in security have not heard of that term. Whatever that ROI is to define. Saving money, reducing risk, making the developers look bad, whatever you want to call that ROI, however you define it. But you've got to show that. You've got to show that with application security because, again, people look at security as a big waste of their money. They're going to go out there and they're going to give you $200,000. What are you going to give me for $200,000? Let me show you this report with cross-site server scripting, and I've got my SQL injection right here. The developers half the time will sit there and go, okay, explain to me SQL injection again. I don't get it. And I remember spending an hour and a half once explaining to a developer how cross-site server scripting worked. He just kept looking at me with his blank stare. He's like, well, why do I care about that? Why do I care about that? Why do I care about that? Until finally the light bulb goes off. Okay? Think about your ROI. You've got to produce that ROI. You've got to produce those metrics. You've got to generate this stuff. Why? Because the business wants to see what they're getting for their, again, $200,000, $500,000, $1 million investment in your idea. I like that line right at the bottom. Just remember, when you show risk, you always want to show the arrow going from the top left down to the bottom right. Don't show it going the other way. You're not selling more risk, you're reducing risk. People always seem to make a graph like that, and they think that people are impressed with the trend going up the wrong direction. This is just a generic slide I put in here. I've actually got a little bit better one I'm going to show you in a second. But we think about, aligning with the SDLC. The big thing I want to do is I want to be able to do some static testing. I want to be able to do my code inspection. I want to move into more dynamic testing, things that we think about when I go out and I get my cool application security tools. I get them from Rapid7 or you get them from HP, or you just go ahead and use Burp. Whatever you want to do. That's about as much as I'm going to plug any vendor so far. I think that's going to be about it. And then finally, you move into the pen test phase if you really want to do pen testing at this point. But when I think about the SDLC, I do need to get myself wedged in here. And I do need to make it an iterative process. So when new releases come in, I need to get myself kind of wedged back into the process of, scan, do my dynamic testing, and then finally do like a last minute, kind of a sanity check on the app, and then boom, release it again. So recently I've been trying to get company I work for to define a formal application security program and to essentially move forward with it. As I even told them, I said, I will help you get it started. I will hand it off to another manager or whomever is going to run it, some director of whatever, and I will give it to you. And let's get this thing going. First phase, again, we mentioned this earlier, architecture. Get yourself aligned with the architecture. Make sure that you know what's going on. Make sure that your standards are defined. Make sure that people know that when I say encrypting something, I'm not saying, we got to use, encryption over the wire, encryption of the file, and encryption of. I actually had a guy do this. He defined, and he was trying to be helpful. He defined the standard for security for the data protection with 3 layers of encryption. Yes, it was highly secured. The only problem was, per project, it was going to cost between $300,000 and $400,000 a project. That was just for a single project's cost to do it his way. And actually, he managed to convince a couple projects to do it this way. And now I'm in the position of trying to explain to people, no, that's not how our standards are. We can't afford to do that. It's not practical. And it's funny because even me and this gentleman get into it every now and then, and I'm like, I'm a bad guy. Do you honestly think I'm going to break your encryption over the wire? I'm just going to come and steal it in your database. I don't care about breaking encryption. I'll wait. I'm patient. So again, I get back to my architecture phase, in step 1, step 2 of here. I'm going to do, my assistance in the high, low-level design. For example, I'm going to make sure, hey, do you have this encrypted while it goes over the internet? That sounds like a great idea. Is it encrypted at rest? Does it have, what type of data is in it? If the data inside this application contains, it contains a random user ID with a blood type, as long as I can't, kind of translate those two or apply it to somewhere else, or it's somewhat anonymized, or it doesn't even contain valuable information, I may not even want to encrypt it. Why spend the time and money to do it? So again, at the architecture phase, and even in my point in my life, I've realized that over-securing things is just a waste of money. I've got to secure it to just the right amount to cover the need. I then move into static code scanning. Basically, I start going into the actual code itself, trying to revise it. If I can get a decent developer, and typically in programs I've done before, I always do leads, because it's hard to train all the developers to do, kind of coding towards security. But I usually have kind of like a lead program where I'll get, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 10 developers and certain critical units trained up on how to do secure coding. At that point, I will then have them go through and essentially kind of clear code. So every week or every 2 weeks or once a month, however often you want to do it, I have them go through, clear the code, and they make sure that the code meets certain conditions. Once the developers kind of get up to a certain speed, and it takes a while. For me, when I was working at NetJets, it took about a year for the critical developers, the key developers, to essentially build their coding skill sets to handle this. By the time that I got up to there, I told them that they've turned me into the Maytag repairman. And the reason why is because when I'd go out and I'd actually do the dynamic security testing, I was bored. I couldn't find anything. I started out from finding all these critical vulnerabilities and doing all these, cool whiz-bang things. And hey, look, CIO, I just dumped the entire employee database right here. This is so cool. Aren't you proud of me? And the guys, you can see the steam coming out of his ears. By the time that I got to, 3 years later, I was bored. I couldn't do anything. They'd gotten good enough that the coding, I'd actually do the code assessment and then do dynamic assessment, and those things would match identically. I'd lay them over top of each other. The number of things that were found were identical. It was almost scary. It was just at times just amazing to see that really work, and that's how it should work. And then finally, I kind of throw this in here nowadays, the web, mobile vulnerability security scanning. I might run, some type of automated, vulnerability assessment against it, make sure that I've at least thrown something against it to take a look at it. And finally, I get to the manual testing. After all of this, I'll go through with manual testing and make sure that there's nothing that I necessarily missed. My big thing I would say is for steps 3, 4, and 5, I would try to automate as much of that as possible. Make your life easier, because again, unless you've got $400,000 a project to go ahead and run security on a project, you're going to try to automate as much as you can. And then finally, I'll break out Burp Suite and start beating away on it. Yep. Actually, I'm going to talk about that next. Yes. Again, no worries. I appreciate it. So let me. I'm going to actually talk about that here in a second. So when I think about this is kind of like the one that I've been using lately. And it's called JFlow. But when I look at the beginning, I look at my initiation phase. You see the numbers. All those previous ones, 1 through 6. When I'm in, during design and architecture, this is where I'm going to take a look at things. System design, right? I'm going to go through, do my code analysis. Finally start doing my dynamic analysis. And you'll actually see that there's another step for dynamic analysis later as well. I want to do it later on. Look to do my mobility testing. Again, I said, you don't want to necessarily do it right before implementation, but mobility testing is a little harder to do these days because you have to have an actual finished product. Right? And then finally, I'll go ahead and do my sanity check at the very end, doing manual testing. And as always, I still want to go through and I want to do some dynamic testing after the fact. I want to make sure that, if it's been a year, there's been some subtle changes to an app. They weren't significant changes, but they're subtle. I still need to go in and at least do some dynamic testing on the app to make sure that there's not some glaring risk that was introduced or somebody hasn't done something really bad. So, trust but verify. This is where we get into the third-party risk. And actually, were you here earlier when I did the outline? I stole this from Chris Weissapol. So, yeah, I took it from one of his recommendations to fit into 30 minutes. But trust but verify. Does anybody know what President said, trust but verify? Okay, good. I still bring that up, and people are like, wow, that's a great quote. Yeah, I wish I could have said I came up with it, but... Well, there you go. I'm sure, everyone steals from everybody, right? So once your program's up and running, you start small, you're doing your internal apps, you do some small apps, you do maybe some custom critical components first, you start expanding your program. Eventually, you get to yourself to a point where you're going to probably be bored. All right? You're going to get to this point where you're like, I've run out of things to scan. What do I do now? Start looking at your third-party apps. Start looking at your third-party apps because you'll find that oftentimes this step that you assume that everyone's done, because everybody does application security, right? Because it brings so much value to them that they like, let's volunteer to spend $1 million. Guess what? They didn't do squat. So again, I'll go back to the aviation days. What happened is, as our application security program started to mature, people started talking about it. Next thing you know, there's a third-party app that everybody was going to use in the particular, aviation community, and the FAA is like asking my company, hey, can you guys go ahead and assess this app? We can't formally assess it, but can you give them some recommendations on what they should or shouldn't do on their app to make it better? Because it's going to house some critical components, and we don't want the airmen to get upset with the fact that, their personal information's in it, and it's supposed to all be anonymized. So this is where you start moving into that third-party type of setup. You start going in and you start saying, hey, vendor A, what do you have? Can we take a look at it? They're going to say no, right? Because that's what vendors are out there to say, because they don't want you finding their ugly warts. They're going to say no. You say, okay, hey, that's fine. The next time we go through procurement, next time we're going to go buy your stuff, guess what we're going to do? We're going to say you're going to go get it assessed, or you're going to let us assess it. The cheap people will let you assess it because, quite simply, they don't have the money to do it. And in essence, you are helping your own, third-party risk. You're helping your business as a whole. Your business should hopefully understand that. You might have to sell that really hard, just as an FYI. Because, again, a lot of business doesn't understand security. But that's where you build it in. I learned that at a place called JP Morgan. It was originally Bank One, but long stories. Nobody cares, right? Essentially, I would see them go in and they'd go, hey, that's a great idea. Guess what's going to happen? Next time we come up to buy your software, you're going to fix that for us. And if you don't, we're going to put it out to bid for three other bidders. And it motivated people to do some things. I'll give you an example of somebody who said, go pound salt. There was an app that we were using that was for the oil field industry, and in particular for the financial side of it. They're running everything as root, by the way, because, well, that's what you do in the oil industry, apparently. It's a one-of-a-kind app. We found this risk. We said, hey, here's a bunch of these bad things. You got to go do something with this. It went all the way up to the CEO. And essentially, the vendor came back and said, sure, we'll do it. Give us a check for $1 million. March this way to the CEO. CEO goes, I'll take the risk. I'm not going to spend $1 million on this guy's app to fix it himself. And it's the only app we got. We're kind of screwed. But that is what you do have to eventually evolve to. The evolution process. You will eventually get so bored of your internal apps, your developers will get good enough, hopefully, that you'll actually be sitting there going, damn, I'm bored. And it's a good feeling, because then you've done your job. But you do need to find something new to, exciting to keep you going. It moves into this, and this will never end. So once the team gets going, the next thing you know, you're cleaning house on your vendors. One thing I do want to point out here, see slide 3 when it comes to assessing your vendors. Don't just assume that your vendor is going to say yes. If you find a risk, you may want to vet that through your legal team. I have seen people get fired for that. Even though they own, technically you own the software to a certain degree. Some companies, you get in legal licensing, you don't really own it, you lease it. That's the best way to put it. So keep that in mind. When you talk about trust but verify, remember security companies get burned on this all the time. I have some security companies that I have pretty good relationships with. They've been in this list of people that have gotten burned. Everybody gets burned, right? There's things that get missed. So when you think about expanding your AppSec program, let's say you get a very mature program. You're to the point where you're assessing all these things. You do all the internet-facing stuff first. You move into your internal apps. You do your critical apps that you've now coincided with your disaster recovery program. So if it's RTO 0, RTO 1, you hit those first, and then you kind of move down your priority list of all the apps that you're going to go ahead and check and make sure that they're doing their best things. Well, if you don't have a formal quality assurance program by now, maybe it's a good time to start. Now, you'll see the big message at the bottom, and I've seen this happen too many times. People actually will begin to think that you are QA. They'll actually believe that your web application security program, your AppSec program is a QA program. You'll have to work hard to differentiate that. Too many times they'll want to lump you together, and then sometimes they'll even put the two teams together, which is fine to a certain degree, but you've got to make sure that everyone understands that their objectives, they're entirely different. They're not even close. Quality assurance is making sure that the app can stand up on its own two legs. You know, application security is, can I rob you blind? Next thing also, I kind of leave that as a option up there. You know, the internal pen test team, or as Amanda said earlier, the purple team has, I think Dave Kennedy quoted purple team. That's the first time I heard it. Maybe he stole it from somebody else. But maybe you stand up your pen test team that starts doing formal pen tests. They start looking at the physical security. They start looking at a lot of different things. You start doing, more risk-based testing to the point of, that you're starting to annoy the business. I don't know. That's one thing I will say is that as the team matures, what you'll usually find that happens with any good team is that as the team matures, eventually people get good to a point that it's time for them to leave. Okay? And what the concern that you have with any type of application security program is if you have that one or two person type of people who are the team, they pick up and they leave, your program is now set back 6 months because now you've got to bring people in and bring them up to speed. Your team's just taking a huge crash. All right. I'll open up for questions in a second. I do want to do the shameless plug here for BSides Columbus. It's going to be in January 2017 again, we're hoping. We did get kicked out of our last venue, so just FYI. That does happen from time to time. But we're going to try to intentionally do it not the same weekend as Shmoo. There's a long, funny story as to how Shmoo and us got paired up on the same weekend. Talk to me afterwards and I'll tell you about it. So think about that. Upcoming talks. Columbus InfoSec Summit. I'm going to do the extended director's cut of this for about 50 minutes. Going to go into a little bit more details, especially in the sense of tools. A couple more things I want to talk about, like in aligning with your RTO with disaster recovery. That's actually where I came up with the idea of the talk. Well, I didn't really come up with it. They said, "Hey, can you put this together for us?" Because people are asking for this, and nobody seems to want to put together how do I build an application security program presentation. I am going to talk about security automation in April at BSides Charm 2016. So I'm still working on that one, getting some ideas. You can link in with me. You can hit me up on Twitter. Just an FYI on LinkedIn, a friend of mine created a fake page for me and put all types of disparaging information about past employers. And he did it in my name. He did it as a joke. I would not link in with him. Okay? If you see my face on there, you can link in with that. If you want to link in with the other guy, understand something. He messes with some people. He's got some interesting connections too, some strippers and stuff like that. So, not me. Obviously, I'm a little more buttoned down than that. But the one thing I will say is this: if you do have questions, I'm more than willing to answer them for you. If you have questions on advice, I'm more than willing to answer advice questions. Please don't turn it into consulting. Consulting is a whole other business. I don't have 5 hours to just give away at a moment's notice. I have people like my employer who ask that of me already. Hey, what you doing next month? We got something for you to do. So any questions on what we talked about? Someone's got to have something. Anybody got a good story? Threat modeling. It's funny. We're talking, where I am right now, we're talking about getting into threat modeling. Where I was before, we were starting to get into it, and then the company said, you know what, we just don't want to spend any more money on security. So then everybody left. I think in the long term there is some value, but the problem that you have is that in order to sustain all these existing security functions that people want to do it costs a certain amount of money. And right now, the problem I see in security is that a lot of people they'll have pet projects that, in my opinion, don't achieve a whole lot, but they look really cool. And people are like, wow, I never knew that was ever possible. And they kind of reduce no risk. But threat modeling is important, it's critical. You look at like the whole governance process, you get into how you want to, trying to think how I want to phrase this. You get into like, plausible threats, and you start thinking about how you want to define the risk and trying to mitigate the risk. That's when you start getting into how can I take a threat model and actually drive it down to the point of, that 1% that I'm willing to live with. What percentage is it happy per se? But you do see threat modeling getting more and more traction, but usually I see it at big companies. I don't see it at small companies. Most companies, small companies, I mean, it's usually, the firewall was bought at Best Buy. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the Best Buy firewalls. And some people might be laughing in here, but I'm telling you, people, that is the security program. Even the company I'm with right now, in North America alone, they have 50,000 people. I'm not going to say anymore. I like to be employed. But there's lots of definitions of security. I can't emphasize that enough. There are lots of definitions of security. Your definition of security isn't their definition of security. Any other questions? Anything about AppSec? All things AppSec? I do not profess to be the AppSec god. There's other people out there who claim to be. Let them be it. So, all right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it.